The war was over. Europe lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The guns had finally fallen silent across blood-soaked fields from Normandy to Berlin. And in the quiet aftermath, when the generals finally stopped sending men to die, they began doing something far more dangerous than fighting. They began telling the truth. Omar Bradley sat in his study. The year was 1951. 6 years had passed since victory. 6 years since the champagne and the parades and the triumphant return home. A journalist asked him a simple question. "General Bradley, what do you really think about George Patton?" Bradley paused. His weathered face tightened. His jaw clenched. Then he said something that would rewrite how history understood the most controversial general of World War II. "We won faster because of Patton, and faster meant fewer graves." That admission shattered decades of silence, because Bradley had spent the entire war restraining Patton, arguing with him, sometimes openly opposing him in strategy meetings, yet here he was, 6 years later, speaking a truth he could never have uttered during the fighting. Patton had saved American lives by risking everything, and Bradley knew it. He had always known it. But that wasn't all, Bradley admitted, in the years that followed, as old age softened the edges of duty and discretion. As memory became more important than reputation, Bradley revealed something even more painful. Something about the price Patton paid for being exactly what the war needed. Something about the internal war that killed him before the accident ever did. This is that story. The story of what Bradley finally said when silence was no longer necessary. They were never supposed to be friends, never supposed to understand each other. Omar Bradley was Earth, solid, dependable, quietly brilliant in ways that didn't make headlines. He spoke in measured tones. He calculated casualties like an accountant balancing books, weighing every life against the objective. His soldiers called him the GI's general because he never wasted lives for glory or personal ambition. George Patton was fire, loud, profane, relentless as a thunderstorm. He wore ivory-handled pistols like a gunslinger from the Old West. He believed destiny had personally chosen him to lead armies. He quoted Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. He spoke openly about reincarnation, claiming he had fought in ancient battles. Where Bradley saw duty, Patton saw fate. Where Bradley saw chess, Patton saw destiny. At West Point, their paths first crossed. Patton was already a legend in his own mind, already building the mythology that would define him. He studied military history harder than anyone else at the academy. Trained longer, pushed himself until his body literally broke down. Other cadets thought he was showing off. Bradley noticed something different, something others missed entirely. Beneath the swagger and the carefully constructed arrogance lived a man absolutely terrified of failure. Patton's confidence was a mask, Bradley later wrote in his memoirs. Behind it was someone desperately afraid of not measuring up to his own impossible standards, standards no human being could actually meet. That fear would define everything Patton became. It would make him brilliant in battle. It would make him dangerous in peace. It would drive him to achieve the impossible. And eventually, it would destroy him completely. North Africa, 1943, the American army was bleeding out in the desert. German tanks under Rommel carved through inexperienced American units like scissors through paper. Young soldiers who had trained in Georgia and Texas found themselves facing the Afrika Korps, the most experienced desert fighters in the world. Morale collapsed like a house of cards. Soldiers openly questioned whether they could ever match the Wehrmacht's brutal efficiency. Then Patton arrived. He walked into command headquarters and immediately became the most hated man in the American Army. He demanded perfect uniforms in the scorching desert heat. He required helmets at all times, even in camp. He court-martialed officers for minor infractions that others would have overlooked. He fined soldiers for not shaving. Men despised him. They cursed his name. They called him a tyrant. Bradley watched carefully from his position. He didn't approve of Patton's methods. The public humiliation, the ruthless discipline that seemed excessive, but he couldn't deny the results that came within weeks. American units stopped retreating. They stopped looking over their shoulders. They held ground against German counterattacks. Then they advanced. The transformation was remarkable. Units that had been broken just weeks before now moved with confidence and precision. They stopped fearing the Germans. They started hunting them. Patton restored pride when we had almost none left, Bradley admitted years later. Coming from Bradley, who never praised lightly and who measured every word, those words carried enormous weight. Patton hadn't just reorganized an army on paper. He had rebuilt its soul through sheer force of will. But that restoration came at a cost. Bradley would spend the rest of his life calculating, a human cost that couldn't be measured in after-action reports. Sicily, August 1943, to hospitals. 2 exhausted soldiers suffering from what we now recognize as severe combat trauma and PTSD, and to slaps that nearly ended Patton's career forever. The first soldier was Private Charles Cull. Patton found him sitting in a hospital tent, no visible wounds. "What's wrong with you?" Patton demanded. Cull said he couldn't take it anymore. The shelling, the screaming, the boadies. Patton slapped him, called him a coward, ordered him back to the front. 1 week later, another hospital. Private Paul Bennett, shaking uncontrollably, Patton exploded, slapped him, drew his pistol. "I ought to shoot you myself right now." The news spread like wildfire through military channels. Then it hit the press. Public outrage erupted across America. Politicians demanded accountability. Eisenhower privately considered sending Patton home in complete disgrace. The general who had restored the Army's fighting spirit might be relieved of command for 2 moments of rage. Bradley was there in the aftermath. He saw Patton in a way few others did, not roaring with defiance, not making excuses, shaken to his core, furious at himself, trapped between genuine shame and the absolute certainty that he had been right. Patton believed that any sign of weakness, any acceptance of combat exhaustion, would spread through his army like disease. He was wrong about the method, but Bradley understood he wasn't cruel. Patton carried the war inside him. Bradley later reflected in a private letter. He didn't know how to set it down, not even for a moment, not even when mercy required it. Bradley didn't defend the slapping publicly. He couldn't. The actions were indefensible. But he defended Patton's record. Quietly, behind closed doors, in meetings with Eisenhower, because Bradley understood something the outraged public never would. War demanded men capable of doing terrible things for necessary reasons. And Patton was exactly that kind of man. The slapping incidents became Patton's defining scandal. Newspapers ran the story for weeks, but to Bradley, they revealed something else entirely, something darker and more complicated. Patton had no off switch. The intensity that made him unstoppable in combat made him impossible in every other context. He couldn't distinguish between the battlefield and the hospital tent. France, 1944, Patton's Third Army became a force of nature, unlike anything the modern world had seen. They moved faster than any mechanized army in history. German generals literally couldn't believe their intelligence reports. Entire American divisions appeared in sectors where logic said they couldn't possibly be. The speed defied understanding. Patton outran his supply lines constantly. He ignored direct orders to slow down and consolidate. He drove his men until they collapsed from exhaustion. Then he drove them further. Bradley spent half his time enabling Patton's genius, finding ways to supply an army that moved too fast. The other half he spent restraining it, trying to prevent Patton from driving straight into disaster. They argued constantly in heated strategy sessions. Bradley worried about exposed flanks and unsustainable logistics. Patton worried about wasting opportunities that would never come again. "We should have gone straight to Berlin," Patton would later rage after the war. "We could have ended this months earlier." Bradley knew that wasn't strategically possible given Allied politics and Soviet agreements. But he also knew Patton was often right about what could be accomplished if someone was willing to risk everything. Patton saw opportunities others didn't because he thought, like the enemy, Bradley admitted years later. German commanders feared him more than any Allied general, even more than Montgomery, and in war, fear is a weapon as powerful as tanks. That admission cost Bradley something personally, because it meant acknowledging that Patton's apparent recklessness wasn't always reckless. Sometimes it was vision that Bradley's careful caution couldn't match. Sometimes the safest path was the most aggressive one. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's desperate gamble caught the Allies completely off guard. German panzers punched through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, cut off and freezing. The situation was catastrophic. The entire Allied advance had ground to a halt. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. Every major general in the European theater attended. The mood was grim. How long would it take to respond? Most estimated weeks. The Third Army was 90 miles away, facing south, engaged with German forces. Turning that massive force north in the middle of winter seemed impossible. Patton stood up, his voice cut through the pessimism. "I can have 3 divisions moving north in 48 hours. The room went completely silent. Several officers laughed nervously. It was insane. Turning an entire army that size, in those conditions, with that speed. The logistics alone would take a week just to plan properly. "George, I know you want to help," one general said carefully. "But be realistic. These are winter conditions." Patton's face hardened into stone. "I've already drawn up 3 contingency plans depending on where you need me. Give me the order, and I'll break through to Bastogne in 4 days maximum." He did it in 3. Bradley watched it happen in real time, barely believing what he was seeing. The impossible made real through sheer force of will and brilliant planning nobody knew Patton had already completed in secret. German High Command intercepted the American troop movements and refused to believe their own intelligence reports. "It's not possible," one German general wrote in his war diary. "The Americans cannot move an entire army that fast in these conditions. The intelligence must be wrong." But it wasn't wrong, and Bradley knew exactly why it worked. Patton didn't just command armies, Bradley later wrote, he willed them forward through belief that bordered on madness. His men accomplished the impossible because Patton made them believe it was possible. The war ended May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Bradley noticed the change in Patton immediately. It was like watching a light go out. Without an enemy to fight, Patton seemed lost, unmoored. He paced constantly like a caged animal. He spoke endlessly about missed opportunities, roads not taken, campaigns that could have continued into Eastern Europe. "We should have kept going," Patton insisted to anyone who would listen. "Straight to Moscow. The Soviets will be the next enemy." Bradley saw the danger clearly. Peace required restraint, diplomacy, political awareness. Patton possessed none of those qualities. He spoke his mind openly at press conferences. He made controversial comparisons that infuriated politicians. He refused to soften his language for peacetime sensibilities or public consumption. Bradley tried desperately to protect him. He intercepted reports before they reached Washington. He softened Patton's words in official communications. He redirected his impulses into harmless channels. "I spent more time preventing Patton from destroying his own legacy than fighting the Germans." Bradley later confessed to a friend, but it wasn't enough. Patton's controversial comments became impossible to defend or ignore. Washington ran out of patience completely. The order came quietly through official channels. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. Bradley personally delivered the message. He never forgot Patton's expression in that moment. Not anger, not the expected defiance, just disbelief, complete incomprehension. Patton had survived North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He had faced everything the Wehrmacht could throw at him, but peace defeated him. "That moment stayed with me longer than any battle," Bradley admitted decades later, "because I realized the war had used Patton up completely, then discarded him like a broken tool." December 9, 1945. A phone call reached Bradley at his office. Patton had been in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. Bradley hoped it was minor. He waited for updates. Within hours, the news got worse. Patton was paralyzed. Within days, George S. Patton was dead. Bradley sat in silence after hearing the final news. No speeches, no tears. Just heavy realization settling in like winter cold. Patton would never defend himself now, never explain his actions to history, never find the redemption he desperately needed. At Patton's funeral, Bradley stood among the mourners in the cold rain. He looked at the flag-draped coffin and thought of all the impossible miles Patton had marched, all the enemies he had terrified into retreat, all the soldiers he had driven forward when victory seemed impossible. And he thought of how utterly alone Patton had been at the end. "Patton frightened people in life," Bradley later wrote in a private journal. "In death, he frightened us differently. By reminding us how quickly heroes are forgotten once they're no longer useful." Years passed slowly. Patton became myth rather than man. The pearl-handled pistols, the profane speeches that soldiers quoted, the slapping scandals that defined him in the public mind. Hollywood eventually made him larger than life. History books struggled to categorize him properly. Hero or villain, genius or madman, brilliant tactician or reckless glory hound. Bradley watched this transformation carefully over the decades, because he knew neither version was true. Patton was far more complicated than legend allowed. Late in life, when Bradley himself was elderly, he spoke with unusual openness to historians. Patton was not easy to follow, he said carefully. But when men followed him into battle, they believed they would survive. That belief carried them forward when fear tried to pull them back into foxholes. He admitted something else, something that surprised even his closest friends. I did not always protect him the way I should have. I chose stability over brilliance, order over momentum, peace over speed. Those were the right choices for the army, but they weren't fair to Patton. It wasn't an accusation against others. It was an admission against himself. A confession of guilt that had haunted him for decades. Bradley was often asked the impossible question by historians and students: would the war have ended sooner if Patton had been unleashed completely? If politics hadn't restrained him? Bradley never gave a clear answer. Not because he didn't know, but because the truth was too complicated for simple answers. Patton lived on the edge of possibility and disaster, Bradley explained carefully. Sometimes leadership means pulling back even when success feels close, because the cost of failure would be catastrophic. But privately, in letters and journals, Bradley reached a painful conclusion. Patton belonged to another time entirely. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte. Ancient wars where victory mattered more than explanation, where generals didn't answer to politicians and journalists. Modern warfare, with its complex politics and media scrutiny and diplomatic restraint, was too small for him. Patton needed a war the way some men need air, Bradley wrote. Without it, he faded like a flower without sun. War was his natural element. Peace was suffocation. That wasn't criticism, it was tragedy. The recognition that some men are built for crisis and cannot survive ordinary life. Near the end of his life, Bradley spoke the words that define his true feelings, the words that changed how historians understood Patton forever. He was asked directly during a recorded interview to summarize his relationship with Patton. I argued with Patton constantly. I restrained him when he wanted to charge forward. I even opposed him in strategy meetings. But here's what I know with absolute certainty. I would want him beside me in every war we ever fought. That wasn't nostalgia speaking. That was respect earned in fire and blood. Bradley understood something few people did. Patton absorbed the chaos so others could bring order afterward. He was the storm that cleared the path for everyone who followed. When asked to summarize Patton in a single sentence, Bradley paused for a very long time. The interviewer waited. Finally, Bradley said, "He was the most dangerous man on our side." And that is precisely why he worked. Not a villain, not a flawless hero. A man built specifically for moments of absolute crisis. A man whose greatest strengths were inseparable from his most dangerous flaws. A man who helped win the war and could not survive its ending. Bradley survived into old age. Patton did not. Bradley carried the weight of memory for both of them, and he understood something. History rarely admits honestly. Survivors get to shape the narrative. The dead do not get to defend themselves. Wars end on paper. Treaties are signed. Parades are held. But wars never truly end in the minds of those who fought them. Bradley carried Patton with him every day, not as a rival, not as a problem to be managed, but as a reminder of what war demands and what it inevitably destroys. If this deep dive into one of World War II's most complex and fascinating relationships captivated you, then you need to subscribe to this channel immediately. We bring you the untold stories from history's greatest conflicts, revealing the human truths behind the legends that shaped our world.